I'll look for your cue. Am I?
Yes, good morning. We are back live with Maura Collins this morning. We're shifting gears back to we were on 276 this morning at 9 o'clock. And now yesterday we talked about this draft bill, DR 230983. And the two pieces of it were to ask the DCF, in section 1 was asking DCF to update the report on pathways out of homelessness, and then the second half was to work for people to work with the Agency of Human Services on homelessness issues. And we had Representative Chestnut Tangerman had mentioned that Maura Collins from the HFA wanted to be able to testify on these that these would operate as amendments to our rental registry bill, if all goes well with it. I mean, in our conversation today, but that would be my goal for crossover day is to approve these as they're written and then perhaps add them to the rental registry if we vote to approve the rental registry. So with that, microphone is yours. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm Maura Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. And I really appreciate that introduction because I was a little confused because I was on the agenda under rental registry, but on an attachment that had to do with homelessness, and I was trying to connect the dots, but now I understand better.
Someone had mentioned that
we spoke about, yes, this language. Well, how much history do you want?
we have until 4 o'clock.
Yeah, no. I'm a better witness than that. I'm not taking the bait. I do just want to say a few historical comments, which are that the state of Vermont and all of its many partners and players in quasis, and I don't just mean the state employees, but the housing and homeless response system in the state has long been focused on people without homes. This is not a COVID issue. And so we have made tremendous strides in the data and understanding of the data counting people without homes, as well as our understanding of their real lived experience, as well as the programs we have to address homelessness. And so it was roughly about 15 years ago when the federal government came out with this concept of an interagency council on homelessness. And the model was you should have cabinet level leaders at the federal government working together on how to end homelessness. And it honestly, it seemed a little bizarre to me, HUD, yes, human services, yes, but why would the post office, Postmaster General need to be on this commission? Well, it turns out the post office knows about vacant homes. They know a lot about transient movements and things like that. And why would, Department of Labor, I think, is maybe a little more clear about job training programs. But point being is that people without homes are like any of us that engage with governmental services and have needs that really are much broader than just the housing and services buckets that we so focus on. And so Vermont followed the federal lead, as did most states. There was a real push and we all realized this is smart. And so we had a homeless council that was created, and it was secretary level leadership of not only quasi-governmental agencies like the Housing Conservation Board, the Housing Finance Agency, the State Housing Authority, but also the Governor's Administration with the Agency of Human Services, Agency of Education, obviously the ACCD, the Commerce Community Development, under which housing lands, and others. It's evolved over the years. It became, this leadership model. At some point, you go to enough meetings and they start sending their proxies and their designees. And that's why I'm so familiar with this, is not because of my role as director of VHFA, but I was the worker bee who would go to the meetings and participate on behalf of my agency, which was supposed to be, my executive director going. And things changed over time. with this model. And we also do have the continuums of care that I hope you've heard about in this committee, which are more on the ground grassroots homeless response systems. That's the shelter providers, the designated agencies, some housing providers and the like. And at some point, Maura's opinion is it all got a little convoluted about what do we talk about at a homeless council meeting? What do we talk about at a statewide continuum of care meeting? And then to confuse things more, we have a housing council, which housing includes homelessness, but it also includes the Department of Fire Safety, talking about life safety issues. We have housing builders, and really the conversation is much broader. I'm giving a little of this background because currently the state does not have an active homeless council in this moment. The last executive order for the homeless council, I believe I heard, I didn't look this up myself, but I was told by someone at the agency that it just expired in December of 22. I don't want anyone to misunderstand that the state has not had 15 plus years of a homeless council that was active and engaged, and we've had plans to end homelessness all along the way. I believe our most recent plan to end homelessness, I forget if it was a 5 or 10 year plan, but I think it expired really early in the pandemic. And I'll say from VHFA's perspective, we did not push in 2020 to start working on a new plan to end homelessness. We didn't start agitating with our partners and ourselves to get a plan because we were a little busy at that moment trying to keep people alive before vaccines were a thing. And the idea of congregate shelters became all of a sudden dangerous as opposed to a safety move. And so, but the world is changing and the crisis is still with us, and yet we have to acknowledge that it's changed. And with that, I think there is the opportunity to pick our heads up and say, what is our plan here? And so before this bill in this language, which I am going to speak to, the Agency of Human Services, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, VHFA, and several others have been coming together and saying, okay, we have an opportunity to reimagine this. Do we just start up the machine that we had running most recently, or do we want to build a new machine? And what does that look like? And we've been talking about the growing conversation around equity and how do we ensure that voices of people with lived experience are represented? And how do we make sure that we keep the accountability on the institutions, the funders who hold a lot of resources and programs and implementation so that we're held accountable to design programs in response to the needs of people without homes. And so the Agency of Human Services has already started convening some early conversations with a very small group of people to be like, okay, here's what the Housing Council has looked like. Here's what the Homeless Council used to look like. What do we want to build for the future? And so I want you to know that those conversations are happening. And I don't know where they're going to end up. They're still pretty early, but I think that there is broad agreement that something needs to be done. When I read the language that's being considered here, I see that you all are on the same page, which is good because smart people often have similar ideas. And I'm seeing language that speaks to the Agency of Human Services bringing together a bunch of voices to create some kind of body that would be responsible for assessing the current situation and planning for the future. The first part of what I was sent, or this section, speaks to moving from adverse weather conditions to crisis standards. And I have to say, VHFA is not a homeless response agency. We definitely engage with housing policy, and we look to make sure that our permanent housing resources are creating housing opportunities for people without homes. But I don't really have an opinion on, because I don't understand it. No one comes to my door when the weather's bad or other crisis level standards happen. And so I don't know what drives acute demand on a nightly basis. So I don't have opinions on that. That said, it's Maura, so I have opinions on things that aren't my business. And I have to say that the list of agencies that I see is a head scratcher to me. Because when I think about if you were going to hear from folks or engage folks about changing our standards of homeless response from like adverse weather conditions to crisis standards, I would want to make sure that we were hearing from the shelter providers because they're the ones who see the inflow and outflow of folks, the community action agencies, the service providers, the designated agencies, and folks working with survivors of domestic and sexual assault. When I see Champlain Housing Trust, I'm like, well, that's good for that region. They are a housing provider, but why not say a regional nonprofit housing provider? I don't know which one needs to be in there. And so I would just challenge you to think more about who you want to hear from and who should be engaged in that. When I move to the next part, which is talking about having a state plan to end homelessness, the HFA is fully in support of that. You don't use those words, but that's what I'm reading when I read this. It's talking about doing some planning. I think we heard that from the state auditor's office last year. They looked at the money that's been spent in the last few years on people without homes. And the very last paragraph of that really called out, these are, I'm going to summarize to say, these are good investments, but since we don't have a plan to know how many units we need, it's hard to know how far down the road we just got with these investments we've made over the last few years. And I think that's an interesting question that that's a fair one. And it's, the end result is not going to be that clean and clear because we never stop the world at a moment in time and then build housing and then compare how we did. There's always the inflow of people and the outflow, and it's a hard thing to get at. But what you have here is a great list. It's modeled after, again, I keep talking about the feds, but this Federal Interagency Council on Homelessness just came out with a new federal plan to end homelessness, which has been very well received by agencies like mine, Housers, and many as being easily accessible document and a smart approach. And so I like that this legislation has about 6 things that it's saying that the future plan would have to include. It talks about data and outcomes, talks about equity, housing creation and investments, talks about trying to prevent homelessness. I talked about that, front door. And so I think that those are the right things to include in a plan. And I think that aligning with what the state's going to do with what the feds have said should happen is great. The federal goal of reducing homelessness by 25% by the year 2025 is a great first step. That's where the feds landed. I'd love to see Vermont be able to do that or more. We can always beat the feds. I got no problem with that. Many ways, Vermont exceeds what other states are doing. Maybe we'll rise to that occasion. And so I do think that what is described in the legislation is beyond what I've seen our previous plans to end homelessness being. It kind of reads to me, I think we need a plan to end homelessness and a housing supply action plan. And these 2 documents would be in support of each other and probably should be created in concert with each other and with some information going back and forth. But I could almost see 2 different planning groups doing this because you can't end homelessness without housing. And so the minute you start talking about ending homelessness, you start talking about, programs like VHIP and rehabilitating unused rental housing and accessing vacant homes. You start talking about new construction and tax credit housing and all that. But then you also talk about the homeless housing programs like the family supported housing and the housing opportunity program grants and things like that, which is like homeless dedicated housing. And you need both if we're really going to reduce the number of people without homes. We need to have permanent housing. We need permanent supported housing. We may need transitional housing. We may need to figure out what our emergency response is. We need prevention. We need all these things. So I think that this language is on the right course of setting that out. As someone who's been writing these plans over the last many years, I'm a little intimidated by the timeline you have. And if I was a person who didn't have an indoor place to sleep tonight, I would be a little intimidated by that too. So I don't know what I'm recommending in terms of timeline, but the idea of writing a comprehensive plan as ambitious as the one that's laid out in the proposal is going to be tough to do in 6 months. Traditionally, it's taken us longer. Now that we have a greater awareness of some mistakes made in the past in terms of equity and how we haven't always centered voices of people with lived experience, I think we've learned that to do that justice, it takes a little longer. And if I were participating in future planning, I now do things differently than I did 5-10 years ago. I've learned. And I don't want to lose that. And I don't want artificial deadlines and urgency to take away from that input. And again, there's 2,000, don't quote me on the number, but just under 2,000 people without homes in Vermont. And to say I need longer than 6 months just to plan for what I'm going to do is also not an adequate response. And so I'm not helpful in giving you a number. I'm just saying getting it all done by January 15th is going to be a real lift.
Thank you for that. And, you know, from our perspective, of course, we're struggling with if we get a report in or legislative recommendations in the middle of March, that's not going to help either.
Yep, I know. And that's why I'm saying I'm not being helpful to you. And maybe it's we bring you where we're at in January, and maybe we can get it done by January. Maybe we just not feel the pressure, though, that we have to get it perfect by January. And maybe it's, you know, a little understanding, maybe it's an interim report and that the final version, because what I'm envisioning, and this isn't said in the legislation, and so maybe this is the disconnect that I'm having. I'm so used to having a 10-year plan to end homelessness, or at one point we had a 5-year plan to end homelessness, which is the weight of you start to plan out what can be done realistically. Maybe if you're just looking for like an immediate action plan, that would be easier. Like, okay, next legislative session, what would be the budget implications or policy implications that the legislature needs to consider? That's a smaller ask than what I'm seeing now, which is really plan for how we're going to move the ball down the field, you know, over the next several years. And so maybe we could, and I'm speaking on behalf of a committee that doesn't exist, that is probably 20 organizations large, but I'm just thinking maybe there's some kind of happy in between of an initial set of recommendations for that year, and the 10-year planning may take just a little longer.
I think section 2 that we're talking about here is the more immediate one. It's the ability to resituate a council or a group of people who can address, especially if we're looking for the short term, reduced by 25% the problem. And then the first section, I think, is more oriented to dealing with the, I'm sorry, I'm losing the name here, the roadmap to end homelessness, which is one of the longer term things. I mean, I haven't read it closely enough since 2018, but you know, it is one of those things where, what this does is what that does is to say, hey, look at, because the roadmap was done in consultation with a whole bunch of stakeholders, and it was written by a consultant, and we're asking them to review it and update it. You know, perhaps not to have to go through a whole consultancy project, but it is one of those long-term things. I would actually, during our non-existent time off, oh, wait a minute, we just had a week, darn, would be to review it and see. I always like to go back and say, hey, this is what we were all excited about in 2016. How'd we do? Oops, had a pandemic, which did change the way we're even counting numbers of people who are experiencing homelessness.
That's
So,
excellent point. And I think I'm realizing that I'm sorry, but you know how it is when you read legal words and then you talk to someone and sometimes your understanding grows of what the intention is. I think I'm better understanding. I was reading crisis standards of housing as frankly, just kind of comparing adverse weather conditions and thinking about that temperature was how we decide what our response to homelessness is going to be on a given night versus maybe we should look at whatever these crisis standards are in terms of a vulnerability index or something like that to replace that. But what you're talking about, I'm really on board with, and I love the idea of not recreating the many studies we've done. And so looking at the roadmap, which is still a very strong document. Then my question is, then why do you have two different groups?
because one has to review the roadmap and identify the areas that have to be updated that from data that was relevant or contemporary in 2015 or 2016. And the other one is like the here and now, because it's setting up a process. This is like working backwards towards what's going to happen on June 30th. And there's going to have to be an immediate reaction to what we fear happening on June 30th. The folks in section 2 would be okay now between June 30th, because this wouldn't take effect until July 1 ostensibly, is to say, yes, what is it that we can do to take an inventory? We say we've created this many units. We say we're going to create this many units. We know that if we create 500 units, that 500 households who are experiencing homelessness are not going to find a home. We know it's a lesser percentage than what might be available. However, how do we measure those against that 25%? I mean, we know how many households. I guess what's frustrating since 2020 is that we've worked with this idea. We all have said in the past, we can end homelessness, we need to build more housing. We all know it's a lot more complicated than that. And what we've seen is that we have housed we've taken testimony, we've housed over 3,000 households, and there are still 1,800 households with 2,500 humans homeless. And so we know that there's what we don't know is how do we've put into plans to reduce it, and we have units that might be available in the next 2 or 3 years, let's say 2 years till the end of 2025, that would reduce us by 25% if it all worked out perfectly. And I think this group is to deal with the instant, in section 2. This is the group that expired, but also the group that was put into place in 2021 or 2020 and 2021 that had to deal with stuff in total crisis of the instant. So, and asking buy-in from people, from organizations that could reset the council. That's more than housing, because this is about homelessness. This is about actually trying to get these next steps down so that we get beyond, we just need to build more housing. We need to provide the services to make that housing sustainable. We need to check off the list. Are we looking at it with the right people in mind? So that's my understanding of the language, the way that my brain interprets legalese in conjunction with our recent experiences in what we're facing.
I'd be nervous to participate in one and not the other. I'm just wondering why have two different groups for section 1 and section 2?
Again, I think one is more technical writing. I mean, it's reviewing and identifying where it has to be updated. There may be overlap with organizations, but when you said there's 4 different groups about some of these issues, and today we're talking about housing where we can't talk about homelessness.
Yeah.
I think those questions might still exist in a human way, sure, but I think we wanted to see them separated out to identify. And also, one is going through DCF and one is going through the larger organization. I think the first one is shorter. Well, it's not shorter on time.
Well, it is December 1.
Yeah, and so, and actually I'm asking to move it up to November 1. Because I think that's quicker work.
Okay, so they're gonna review the roadmap to end homelessness and update the data and get us that.
And make recommendations about what has to change in the roadmap, what has to be updated in it, and so that we're aware of, because again, I would love to be able to have somebody come back and say, you know what? That was really good work we did in 2016.
Yeah.
We can check off 4 or 5 of the
I see.
10 most important things.
Here's what we did and here's what's still left to do from the roadmap.
And knowing that life is a cycle and
Yeah.
we're still gonna nothing is perhaps solved, but it's been addressed. And the
Yeah.
question is, can we address it in a sustainable and constant way? I mean, that's, hearing the same problems again and again and again doesn't mean they haven't been solved for some people.
Yeah.
It just means that other people are entering systems and experiencing life. And so that first group, again, would be focused specifically on trying to come up using the roadmap as the basis of conversation. But the second one is, okay, what are we,
The longer.
what that to me is the longer haul, because we want that committee to be sustained over time. For whatever reasons, and I'm gonna say it was a crisis.
Yeah.
People burned out and people had to move on to other things or what have you. That committee, those councils just have a tendency to fade away if there's no group really pushing it.
Yeah, and there's been executive orders for both the Housing Council and the Homeless Council, and that's what, like I said, AHS has started some conversations, and that's, I think, the model that they were looking to go forward with. Then I want to just be a little more clear then in my testimony on section 1. Thank you very much. Now that I understand it better, I would absolutely replace the Champlain Housing Trust with the Chittenden County Continuum of Care, because they have a separate Housing Management Information System, HMIS database of who's been served, who's currently homeless, who's been through homelessness, what their outcomes are. It's the equivalent of the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness, but they have the same database, but one covers Chittenden County and one covers the rest of the state.
Rather than going through our inventory of organizations, what if we said something along the lines where the department shall consult with stakeholders who specialize in homelessness prevention and mitigation?
That's awesome. And who participated in the last roadmap, because that was my only other point, is that while the continuums have had the continuums definitely participate in the roadmap, but not the same humans or even organizations. And so I just would love for VHFA and VHCB and some of us who funded the roadmap and really led the work with the consultant, were deeply engaged, to also be, even though we're not direct service providers, we really understood and followed that work. So that's,
So stakeholders specialize in homelessness prevention and mitigation, and organizations who participated in the development of the roadmap.
Well,
Yeah.
how do you invite people who have the will and creativity, who didn't participate in the roadmap, to participate?
I'm hearing that section 1 is an update to the roadmap.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm wondering if that's the priority there. I was thinking that section 2, which is the planning of like, okay,
Yep.
how do we really build in equity? How do we address underserved populations? How do we, build something different for the future, is section 2. And that, that's where I think I would ask your question more.
Well, I was thinking about you mentioning the shelter agencies who really do know what's going on and what elements that we're not aware of need to be addressed.
And I think that comes out, again, I was thinking that when I thought that when it says that there's a plan to implement crisis standards for housing, that's why I thought that was important, but I'm hearing that this is more a plan to assess the current situation and make some recommendations about the immediate response.
Well, it's also says to implement, it's to implement crisis standards, because I think we have so many other standards that I think this was pointed out as being perhaps a missing piece in terms of the other standards of housing that that DCF or OEO or anybody else who works on the GA program has on their checklist. So, Representative Parsons?
Yeah, I just stepping back for a sec about the language of this. Came in a couple days ago. Where did it come from?
This came from the group that was working, some members of this committee and some with Human Services on the
Okay, yeah,
the general assistance
that was.
program and
Am I correct that Representative McGill said Human Services kind of took the lead on it?
yes.
I'm not 100% on the process of all this stuff, but how does Human Services led language become our committee bill on
So-
Wednesday before crossover? I'm not, the merits of it has nothing to do with it.
So the committee, the two committees working together came up with a bill with a number of components. And these are two components from that bill
Okay,
that relate directly to housing. The other components of the bill are more the services related.
And rental related.
And rental related. So that's Human Services is addressing those. I don't know whether they're advancing them or not. But rather than the whole bill that the working group came up with, we're choosing two pieces to advance.
it just seems odd that a working group led by Human Services is now our committee bill. 2 days. It just seems rather odd to me. I figured I'd point that out, that
Well,
this isn't exactly our group committee
it
bill, or
wasn't necessarily led by Human Services. They were a part of it.
what they said.
And it was,
Oh,
they are responsible for GA, so that was their part of it. But there are many elements to it that had to do with renting and tenant and landlord parts, which do fall under our aegis.
yeah, I just was, when Representative McGill was here, she'd mentioned that it was kind of, they took the lead on this. It's a committee bill that I'm a member of the committee and saw it 2 days ago. So it doesn't really feel, and as I said, the merits of it, take that out of it. I'm just talking about, it doesn't really feel very committee bill to me.
So I certainly understand that, and the working group was definitely, we were squeezing in meetings at lunch and before other testimony started, and it was not the process that I would like to see again in terms of being rushed and not having time to, it would have been great for our committee to be able to look at the whole bill and say, yes, we like this, we don't like this, but I guess in the absence of time, we focused on what we thought were the most critical pieces of it, brought those to the committee, and I wish that it had been with more advance notice. So
If you feel rushed, welcome to my chair.
Yeah.
So, I'll just point that out, that seems a little odd. That it'd be perfectly fine if this was in there, was for them, but I'm not a fan of the process, I guess.
I just want to clarify, when you're talking about the committee bill, Joe, we're discussing adding DR 230983 to 276, right? Or are we talking about,
Wasn't it referenced as a committee bill?
and 270, what's that?
Wasn't it referenced as a committee bill? Am I wrong?
I don't know. I'm just trying to clarify because is the committee bill you're talking about 276?
No,
No.
You're talking about the draft requests.
these two sections are technically a committee bill. And they were language that appeared in this other version, this work group product. And we were pulling out these two and putting them into a bill so that we could talk about them. Yes, at the last minute,
They're also an amendment to 276.
but these
right?
are being offered, when we worked these out, they were gonna be offered as an amendment to 276, not as a separate bill.
Right. But we're calling the draft language a committee bill.
Just in this context.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, but ultimately, we're talking about the same thing, which is that are we gonna amend 276 with this language?
These are basically and yes, in a better process, these would be considered amendments to 276, which could come at the last minute from the time perspective. But in order for us to talk about them for over the last 2 days or so, or last week or so, the idea would be we needed to put it into a committee bill because we weren't ready to put them in as amendments to 276.
Okay.
I just had a question, and I think it's just as from my point of view as someone who is new, these amendments to me don't necessarily stand out as something that is related to a rental registry. And is there a reason we're connecting it specifically to the rental registry? I'm trying to wrap my head around that.
Sure. The questions, we think it's germane, or, when we asked, if you've noticed, when we asked attorneys, they give us both sides of, an answer. That these, because they're related to housing, because they're related to, because of under the general rubric of housing, that they're germane to the rental registry.
Okay.
And the clerk will rule on that,
Okay.
if and when it hits the floor, so.
Great. Thank you for clearing that up.
No, I appreciate your concerns, Joe, and I think it's, it's a function of crossover week, it's a function of amendments.
So there's some reason we can't just amend our own bill with this language. Is that technically?
We can. I think what happened over the last week or so, at the beginning of the week when Representative McGill testified, while they had language in a draft form, it hadn't been made into a committee bill.
It was a draft request.
We were not going to take that whole thing, turn it into a committee bill, and then yank out pieces, because we didn't have, the rental stuff that's in this proposed committee bill, this other one. We've heard bill introductions to like eviction diversion. We haven't heard anything about rental caps, or actually we did hear a bill introduction to rental caps, but they're nothing we've taken testimony on, that we've had testimony on. So these became a function in order to make these available to us to speak in the way that we've been speaking about them. We had to turn them into something real. And they could have been amendments, but
And they are kind of amendments in our
we're
calendar.
going to be, yes. And because we're proposing, the intent was not to try to pass this separately. The intent was to try to add it to the rental registry bill. And so there are amendments to that bill.
No, and that's how I've been thinking of it. So I'm interested in what Joe's saying. I hadn't been thinking of this as a committee bill. I've been thinking of it as amendment language that was coming to us from another committee. And I see Joe's point about it not really feeling like a committee bill. I'm just not clear if it I think there's some technical aspect to it having needed to be a committee bill that I'm missing. Cause I just thought we've got possession of a bill, we can amend it anytime we want with language that we want to consider, you know, so I don't see that it needed to be a committee bill to get us
The
here.
confusion was that it could have been, I could have presented these as amendments, but they weren't my work product. They were the work product of a group and which existed in a draft form. And so, personally, I thought that was more fair to have it be a draft from this working group and not presented by me, but which makes it more complicated perhaps that it's working from a draft rather than me saying here.
Yeah, it just, from my perspective, it feels like a committee work or working group work that should have been done and put a bill forward in time and has a number. Instead of, we do committee bills whenever and we pop them into any bill that is suitable.
Yeah, if we were doing this in a separate way, and there are changes to the way we do our process or different clarifications from the clerk's office. And so, if I drop the ball in terms of what, should we just say this is an amendment or this is a committee bill for these two sections that we turn into amendment, that's on me. It was, the clerk's office was just clear with me weeks ago on another issue that they had to be codified in some way before we could, just like in the same category, in the same way that I asked when we do a short form, yes, it's a bonus to just have something up on the board, but in order for us to talk about 213, we had to have a straw vote to take it off the wall and turn it into a long form. So it's just, I'm still getting used to like the protocol of what it should be for how an agenda, how an amendment would work when it didn't exist beforehand.
I appreciate everyone's perspective and thoughts on this. My concern, I'm just curious, so when will it be confusing to others outside of these conversations when it is presented, that it is?
Yeah, when it's presented, it'll be just one piece. It'll be all part of 276.
Right.
And
Okay.
that's what it'll appear in the, calendar is.
With amendments, right? Because it won't be the same as first reading, so.
It'll be, right, it'll be,
Okay, right,
As amended,
yeah,
right,
maybe it's probably a strike all.
yeah.
okay. Right, and to be clear, I do support both the original but I just was trying to understand how it would appear when it leaves here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Joe's point on process is a good one. I mean, I don't know if you would feel differently if this had kind of been brought up as more of a just amendment to a bill we're working on, but that would seem more accurate to me as to what this is. I don't know that you would support it either way, but I think that your point about calling something a committee bill of this committee has not, has kind of had imported to us is a good point, and I wonder if it's kind of a distinction without a difference in terms of where we end up, because I feel like I'm just used to bills that we have possession of considering amendment language, and that's what this feels like to me. So it kind of feels like, but the terminology that was used, and I hear Chair Stevens taking accountability for that, is confusing. I'm glad you brought it up. I do want to support this language and support the work of the working group and our Human Services Committee, and I think it's, is it fully germane to everything else in this bill? Maybe not, but it's about housing and it's a vehicle, right? So it's like that's kind of the mechanics of how we advance these ideas. But yeah, I think it's a good point brought up by Rep. Parsons, and I have been thinking of it just as amendment language in my mind. So, But we gotta do the things to make the clerk satisfied with our, I mean, it's complicated.
And I'll, make sure I keep learning and pay attention to making sure that, I like to run a straightforward ship. And so, but when you're uncomfortable with stuff, I really appreciate you, being able to say it and put it out on the table.
as well.
What's that?
It's me as well.
Yeah, no, I just,
The first time something jumped out at me this year is
Yeah.
a little off, so.
and so, I don't mind being held accountable for that, but I will continue to learn like how best to do this job because this is gonna happen again. Situations like this are gonna happen again at the end of this biennium. When we get bills, when you see what we get from the Senate, I can't tell you exactly what we're getting from the Senate, but you'll see omnibus bills. You'll remember Representative Parsons, how we had to deal with 226 last year, where it was so much stuff that had to go to a different committee. And I mean, we're going to see a lot of that. And I will be very careful about germaneness but also what I'm hearing is, not warnings, but notifications that there's material that has to have a name, has to have a better place for it so that we can consider it that way.
Joe, when my last term, last biennium that I served, there was a bill in natural resources that wasn't moving, and it overlapped with energy. And Representative Sheldon asked me if our committee would take it up. So I introduced it to our committee, and all of a sudden, my bill, because it was mine now, was moving and was on the floor. And it's like, this isn't my bill. This is Representative Sheldon wrote this bill. But in the process, it became my bill. And it was just, I was deeply uneasy with that, because it's like, this is not reflective of where it started, who wrote it, who worked on it. But process we have. But it was a good bill.
Did it pass?
It did.
Okay, good. Okay.
Really took that in a different direction then.
What's that?
Really took that in a different direction.
If it's possible for me to make one final point about the language in front of here before I'm done with the chair.
Does it have anything to do with St. Patrick's Day?
Happy St. Patrick's Day all. It just is in section 2. We've been talking a lot about just participating in these 2 different groups and what's happening. And I just want to call out that I'm really excited by the early conversations that AHS and several of us are having about who might be on such a group as you're envisioning with this section 2. As I said at the very beginning of my testimony, there's some real creativity possible here. I mentioned about the Postmaster General and all that. I'm excited because I think there are other participants who would be very important to a conversation like what I'm reading in section 2 that are not listed, but I don't think your bill needs to be 18 pages long and start naming all those organizations. So the way you have it, that AHS will convene it and it can include these groups and it probably will include others. Makes a lot of sense. I just want to point out that if you name VHCB and VHFA, it would be nice if you name the State Housing Authority. They are a critical partner with that rental assistance. Their portfolio has grown to include manufactured home response, a landlord support program, and other things that it feels to me a bit missing to not have that agency listed if you have the other 2 quasi-state agencies that are somewhat similar
section
to
2.
us. In section 2. But honestly, once we start down that road, I actually have half a dozen other names that I would want to be a part of this. And I don't know that you need to call them all out. It's just, you might either want to cut out VHFA and VHCB and just say continuums and people with lived experience and other agencies or, organizations, or add VSHA in there. Honestly, a good, meaningful working group that is working on section 2 is going to have to include more than you have listed here. And again, so it's always a balancing act you all have about who do you list, or do you just not list anyone and know that we're gonna do the right thing? Or maybe you want to make sure that some groups are listed. Having the people with lived experience, having the continuums of care listed, I think are the two most critical ones that I would want to offer direction on. But otherwise, the institutions, the organizations like VHFA and VHC.
Representatives of other housing related
Yeah.
organizations.
It might just be cleaner and clear. If I were VSHA, I would wonder why those are listed and not the others.
Sure. Representative Burrows?
Believe it or not, I did read the whole all-in report last night. Did.
Impressive.
Star.
And so I know what you're talking about the Postmaster General. And I noted I didn't write down, but I noted all of the kind of myriad unusual suspects that were included. And I wondered, are you familiar with that list?
Mhm.
What I'm talking about? Okay.
I don't have it memorized, but I have read it, so.
Would you say that that's adequate, or would you as Mara add more yourself? Or I guess what I'm asking is that a point of reference and others? Or would you call out other specific?
I don't love putting the list in legislation or in writing for a few reasons. First off, you have to Vermontize that list.
Right.
So in most cases, I would want to Vermontize it. And there's a clear line of how to do that. There's nowhere else that has a VHCB. So if I totally say go with that list, you miss a key component. We've talked about Serve Vermont or other employment support organizations as being potential partners. We looked at the regional planning commissions and municipalities as being welcoming. And so I would lean toward, I think what the chair was saying, which is kind of describing, organizations that work with or support housing and homelessness efforts, and leave it broad and know that Vermont being Vermont, we are going to be as inclusive as possible. I also think there's an important distinction between who's named is on the committee and whose voice we hear from. And that's where it comes into focus groups, outreach surveys and the like. And some of these folks may not want to sit in on this month meetings, but they are going to be critical shapers of the message that comes out.
One of the things that I've heard in the last, since January, before January, but most especially since this committee convened, has been how the makeup of our homeless population has changed in the last couple of years to include people who need more acute services. And even the governor's administration briefing in the first or second week of the session said that 30% of our homeless population today, or as of that day, included people with disabilities or older people who need more acute services. I'm concerned that it was kind of glaring to me that the all-in report or plan counted on a December 22 point in time, which is pretty recent, but it did not include any mention of that kind of acuity or dual or more need.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that get articulated in a question like this?
I think that comes out starting back on section 1, when you look at the data, I think that kind of information will come out. I've heard I was in a meeting with the head of the Federal Interagency Council in December, and he actually was speaking to acuity and the increase in it. And so I do think that they even the feds see that playing out. And especially in states that have a higher incidence of opioids, like Vermont does, I think we're gonna see that even more. And so I think that that's another example where we need to ground source some of the data. And sometimes it's not the HMIS numbers of people, but it is conversations and focus groups. There's an additional report that came out. It's not the roadmap to end homelessness, but VHFA and VHCB partnered together last year, came out with a report that a consultant did. Again, the Corporation for Supported Housing, same consultant, different team. And we held 5 focus groups, including a few with people with lived experience. And that message that you're speaking to about the acuity came out loud and clear. It was actually not so much it was on the shelter providers, because we had a whole shelter focus group, but it was the housing providers who spoke to, honestly, what we're seeing now is so many deaths where a property manager is going into units and finding a body that has been there for a long time, and the trauma of that. I heard of one housing provider in southern Vermont that had, it was 3 or 4 deaths within a week that happened in the units. And so that is how and where that plays out. And so I think that, again, we don't have to be told in legislation how to do the right thing, but either section 1 or section 2 is going to know about the VHFA, VHCB report that just came out late last year that tells that message. And I think that's going to get woven in. And I think that's one way that this language is good and helpful, is that it isn't asking us to start something we've never done. It's actually acknowledging that history I started with and saying, we know you've done reports, we know you've kind of studied this, taking those findings, what should we do next and where are we at? And I appreciate that it's not starting with a blank page, but that we can look at that information. But I think that I think that what you're speaking to is already in the data, and if it's not in the data, it's in those focus group findings that we found last fall.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And now I'm worried that I'm a year off and that VHFA and VHCB's report was a year prior to what I'm saying, but I'll have to check.
The years 2020 to 2022 are just 1 year.
So anyway, if anyone's listening and I have my year wrong, maybe it was late 2021. Maybe it came out in December 2021, not 22.
Tag it to your second COVID shot or whatever. Representative Krasnow.
Thanks. So, I do actually want to point out and go on what Representative Burrows was saying. I was watching another committee yesterday. I know, like, can't get enough, right? But it was in the Education Committee, and they were working on something, and it was discussed, though, that it is important to name specific groups and to not just rely on, as policymakers, it is important to be specific about the groups that are needed to be at the table for DEI and other reasons. So, you know, I'm okay with having the language be more vague, but I just want to be moving forward as we're all learning. I do want to make sure that we take more time to include specific groups in our policy making moving forward, because it is important to be specific about who we need to include in these conversations.
And, oh, sorry.
Thank you.
When I spoke to, actually, I think we need a plan like you list in section 2, which I would call a homeless plan. And I mentioned maybe a housing supply action plan as well. You know, an example I'm thinking of just from this week, VHFA was at a press conference that advocates for intellectual and developmental disabilities had on Wednesday. And, you know, there's a perfect example of an underhoused population. As far as I know, it's about 2,700 people living in shared living environments that would say that they don't have full choice in their housing options because they're limited to the shared housing model, and that if there was more independent housing available, and that takes many forms. And when you talk with both peers with that group and parents with that group, there's actually several models that are being championed. And I think that there's a perfect example of saying, you know, even just people with disabilities, well, the needs of those with IDD are very different than those with severe mental health challenges, those with physical limitations and the like. So I think it's a really important point.
BIPOC.
Yeah.
Aging population, there's many groups, but, yeah, thank you.
All right, anything further for Maura right now? Thank you for helping us spark a conversation.
Thank you.
So committee, what I will, if it's okay, I will share draft suggestions to David, who needless to say is bouncing around. But I would email him, so some language that we just talked about. And it will be ready, we can have it ready for review after lunch.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Anything else before we go offline? All right, pre-rest for this afternoon. Joe, we're not gonna be working until